Ladies and gentlemen, it's quite clear that we are in the month of August in Washington, where many people have a lot of time on their hands. Nevertheless, I am delighted to see all of you here this morning, and I hope the time that you dedicate to this conversation will not be time poorly spent. Dr. Farnsworth, many thanks with some degree of seriousness, and may I thank as well at the very beginning the Council of the Americas as the principal host, CSIS, the National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies, and the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, without whose support, ladies and gentlemen, and co-sponsorship, we would not be here this morning. And that may or may not be a good thing, depending upon how the next hour plays out. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished ambassadors, members of the diplomatic community, distinguished members of the media, and ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin with a story, a make-believe story. Let us call it a fable, if you will. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there lived two kingdoms. One kingdom in the south, we'll say it's a mountain kingdom. Some would want to say there were several such kingdoms, but it's my story, so I will say it the way I wish. And in that kingdom, for reasons having to do with culture and history and tradition, to a certain extent, but also economics and the desire to make money to a very large extent, people in that southern mountain kingdom produced a substance, let's say several substances, that in fact, if misused, cause physical harm to people, but nevertheless, some people liked to use it. In this fable, to the north is a large kingdom, and in that kingdom there are many people, millions perhaps, that in fact have an appetite, a taste for this stuff. They are willing to pay money for it, and in fact have some degree, make some degree of sacrifice in order to use this stuff. And as is inevitable in a sad story and fable of this nature, as you can well imagine, over time, the people that eventually took over the process by which this product was produced and then transported and sold in the northern kingdom were criminals. And what happened, ladies and gentlemen? I would like to offer you my only 3 visual aids in my presentation this morning, if I may. Maestro, may I have the first map, please? What happened, and now you can see I have given away the surprise, but most of you probably had already figured out where I was talking about in my story and my fable. If you had asked me, ladies and gentlemen, 21 years ago in 1990, what is my calculation in terms of how illicit drugs are moving from South America to North America, I would have said to you the overwhelming majority is moving through the Caribbean. Sometimes the Western Caribbean, sometimes the Eastern Caribbean, sometimes by sea, sometimes by air. I would have acknowledged, small arrows, that that is not the only route, but that would be the dominant route. What happened, as you can well imagine? Those both in South America and in North America and in the Caribbean took steps, countermeasures, made efforts to shut down this route of transportation. So how would things look 10 years later? I would suggest, I'm going to try it myself this time, that it would have looked more like this. Notice several things. One, the big thick arrow has moved to the west and is moving up the eastern Pacific. Second, there is a new arrow that you're beginning to see in the year 2000. That is an arrow which symbolically represents the movement of the product across the Atlantic to new markets in Europe and elsewhere around the world. And please note that the other two arrows have not disappeared. I am not suggesting that no product moved 11 years ago through the Caribbean or through Central America, but they were no longer the dominant routes. And finally, may I note as well, because I do see the distinguished defense attaché from the Republic of Colombia in the room today, the fact that I start my big arrow in Colombia is not my assertion that all of the product comes from Colombia, but my acknowledging I do not have a map big enough to show all of the points of origin from which the product is moving. So by 2000, we were confronting a different situation. And the response was, in the year 2000, Plan Colombia, a Colombian plan but strongly supported by several other governments, including my own, to address, stop, reduce, and eventually eliminate the flow of the product from Colombia. Greater efforts with a number of governments to interrupt the flow of narcotics through the Eastern Pacific. And what do we see then 10 years later? We see something, ladies and gentlemen, that looks very much like this. As a result of the efforts in northern South America, in the Caribbean, and in the Eastern Pacific, you now see the overwhelming majority of the flow of narcotics products through Central America on its way to the North American market. And I might add, beginning in the year 2007, you see a squeeze at both ends of the Central American isthmus. Not just the efforts under Plan Colombia and its successor plans to the south, but the beginnings of an impact of the efforts to put the squeeze on the routes to the north in Mexico under the Merida Initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you this long saga, and I will now attempt to shut off my, here's what I will do, not to show you how skillful I am with maps and with PowerPoint presentations, but to give you some understanding of how we got to where we are today. And where are we today? Let's ask ourselves the question, how serious is this threat that is affecting and, in my opinion, threatening the very core institutions of Central America today? First, we calculate that more than 95%, let me repeat that figure, more than 95% of all illicit drugs that enter North America from South America have transited Central America. 95%. What impact might that have on the region? Here is a statistic, dates from 2010, the last year we have full statistics. In 2010, the homicide rate in Honduras was 82 per 100,000 population. In El Salvador, 65. In Guatemala, 41. To put that in some perspective for you, here in the United States, a society not known throughout the world for its pacifism and a lack of violence, our homicide rate is somewhat below 5. More than 70,000 youth in the 7 countries of Central America, and overwhelmingly focused on the northern 3 of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, are calculated to be members of gangs. I say calculated because, of course, the gangs do not participate in official censuses, do not register their members, and do not provide their statistics to local governments and institutions. But the calculation is about 70,000. The entire population of Central America is about 1/7 the population of the United States of America. If you play the statistical game and say, what would this correlate to in the United States? It would be 500,000 gang members on the streets of the United States cities. Ladies and gentlemen, Central America, in a very real sense, is a victim. It is a victim of geography, and it can do nothing about that. It is now, always has been, and I presume until the end of the world, will be located between the two large continents of South and North America. It is a victim of the fact that there is a large demand for a particular product, an illicit product, in North America, and a large capability to supply that demand in South America. It is a victim, in a very real sense, of progress elsewhere in the region. Progress in Colombia, under Plan Colombia, where, thanks to the heroic efforts of a large number of Colombian citizens, the problem has been squeezed down substantially over the last 11 years. And the progress that we see beginning, I submit, more on that later, in Mexico with the Mexican government's efforts to retake control of its own communities, its own streets, and its own borders. And Central America, to a very real extent, is a victim to those factors which it cannot control. It is also a victim of some internal factors, which perhaps it does share responsibility for, and more on that in a moment.